And I should say I really want to strongly recommend that website there, theocracy.org, theocracywatch.org. It's an extraordinary fountainhead of information about dominionism, reconstructionism, and so on. So we're very happy to have Joan with us tonight, so please give a warm welcome to Joan Bokaer.
Thank you. While you're getting the projector set up, I want to thank Ralph White. Where did you go, Ralph? Over there. You're right, this is a first. This is a first, and it's just very exciting that you've done this, and I think this really can change the political discourse in this country. I think that the time is right. So thank you for your extraordinary foresight and insight and ability to pull it together. This is President Bush boarding Air Force One, and the reason he's boarding his plane is that something very important had come up. So important that he had to interrupt his vacation in Crawford, Texas. It was so important that members of the U.S. Congress flew into Washington in the middle of their spring recess and stayed up to midnight passing legislation to keep one woman alive who had been in a vegetative state for 15 years. A silver lining in the Terry Schiavo drama is that much of the country woke up and realized that there's something strange about the folks running our country. And on the bright side, we learned that we still have an independent judiciary. Maureen Dowd, columnist for the New York Times, had an interesting reaction to the Schiavo case. She wrote, "Oh my God, we really are in a theocracy." A theocracy is a form of government ruled by a religion. Iran is an example of a theocracy today. Dowd meant that our country has become a Christian fundamentalist theocracy. She's on the right track and definitely deserves credit for understanding the theocratic overtones of Congress's behavior. But we are not yet in a theocracy. I want to make that clear. If we were in a theocracy, Ms. Dowd never would have been allowed to begin her column with, "Oh my God." I'm just going to quote to you one of the 10 Commandments to show you why she wouldn't have. "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." So we're not in a theocracy yet. Congressman Christopher Shays, Republican of Connecticut, also used the word theocracy in reaction to Ms. Schiavo's case. He said, "The party of Lincoln has become the party of theocracy." As you know, the party of Lincoln is the Republican Party, which was founded as the anti-slavery party. In this talk, I want to show you how accurate Congressman Shays is. We're going to look at, first, a history of how the Republican Party became the party of theocracy. Then we'll look at dominion theology, which is a belief system providing much of the philosophical foundation for the activism of the theocratic right. And the last section I'm calling "Thy Kingdom Come, Thy Will Be Done," showing how the theocratic right is imposing its will on the rest of society. And then we'll conclude with what we can do. So how did we get here? I'm going to go back to the year 1964, the year that Barry Goldwater lost his bid for president on the Republican Party ticket. Goldwater, by the way, has nothing to do with the religious right. He's just your good old-fashioned conservative. But a group of Republican strategists who had worked on his 64 campaign decided they needed to expand the base of the Republican Party, which was too narrow. The party was made up primarily of the very wealthy and Southern white segregationists. One of the people who had worked on Goldwater's campaign was Republican strategist Paul Weyrich. In 1973, Weyrich founded the Heritage Foundation, a think tank to promote the ideas of a new movement that he was helping to create. To expand the base of the Republican Party, Weyrich proposed targeting members of fundamentalist, Pentecostal, and charismatic churches. This talk is not in any way about the individuals who belong to those churches or about their form of worship. I have to say that when I attend those services and go to a lot of those churches, I meet the most wonderful, really kind, decent, honest people. And so it's not about the people. These were the groups targeted by a small group of Republican strategists. Ultimately, this talk is about manipulation of people of a certain faith. The Christian right is not a monolithic bloc, and the person following me, Chip Burley, is going to talk a lot more about that. This talk is focusing on the theocratic wing of the Christian right and how their beliefs are impacting our lives. And by the way, I see people taking notes. I just want to let you know, I mean, if you love to take notes, great, but we have a table out in the back that has a CD of this very presentation with all the slides and the text for $5. We're selling everything a little below our cost, so because we want people to take them and use them, and you can even give this talk yourself. It's all scripted. It tells you when to advance the slides and everything. So, by the way, a lot of people are doing it. It's really fun. Okay. So in 1979, Weyrich coined the term moral majority, which became a major organization with Jerry Falwell at the helm, and he claims the moral majority registered 9 million new voters. In 1981, the Council for National Policy was formed, and it's still meeting today. And the Council for National Policy has served as a kind of command and control center for the theocratic right. You may not have heard of it, although lately there's been more talk about it, but their 3 times a year meetings have been highly secretive. Actually, there's one person in this audience who's speaking tomorrow, and that's Skip Porteous. Are you here, Skip? Where are you? Back there, I think. And when he was exposing the religious right in the 90s, he actually infiltrated that organization. I don't know how he did it, but we have lists of who belonged in the board and everything, thanks to Skip from those years. But mostly it's been very secretive. I don't know how he got in. The council's made up of political operatives, hard-right religious leaders, the big financiers of the far right, extreme anti-tax crusaders, and gun advocates. The first president of the Council for National Policy was the Reverend Tim LaHaye, best known today for co-authoring the wildly popular, sold more than 62 million copies, Left Behind series. Some of the members of the Council whom we'll be talking about today. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our cast of characters. Okay, one of them is Paul Weyrich, whom you've already met. Another is Ralph Reed. Here he is saying the Pledge of Allegiance at a golf club in South Georgia. He's kicking off his campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. This is a very current picture. Reed was executive director of the Christian Coalition during the 90s and had a lot to do with its success. He was a regional director of the George Bush campaign in 2004. And Reed said that he received his political training at the Council for National Policy's youth meetings. Another member of the council is James Dobson. His radio show, Focus on the Family, reaches an estimated 8 million people daily. He also founded the Family Research Council, which is the most powerful lobbying organization of the theocratic right today. Some of the religious leaders belonging to the Council for National Policy include Pat Robertson, founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network, host of the 700 Club, founder of the Christian Coalition and Regents University. Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority and founder of Liberty University also, and the late Rousas Rushdoony. Rushdoony is the father of the Christian Reconstruction movement, which we'll be talking about in the next section of this talk. So in 1989, the Moral Majority disbanded and the Christian Coalition formed. And this brings us to television preacher Pat Robertson. He's the founder of the coalition. I don't know how many of you remember when he ran for president in 1988. Yeah, you do? Okay. Well, do you remember that he actually beat Vice President George Bush in Iowa that year? In the primaries, in the Iowa caucuses? Did you wonder how he did it? He had made a decision to take over the Republican Party from the bottom up. His organization worked precinct by precinct to take over the party leadership at the local level. They really focused on that. And it really was going on in the mid-'80s. It was already going on. Christian Coalition's executive director, Ralph Reed, said to Christianity Today, "We think the Lord is going to give us this nation back one precinct at a time, one neighborhood at a time, and one state at a time." One of the Christian Coalition's tactics was to attend local Republican Party meetings and tie them up for hours. And what they would do is ask a lot of meaningless questions. How many of you go to meetings? How many of you go to meetings where you have a business agenda and you can't get anything done because people are arguing nonstop and questioning everything, and it's very frustrating. So the traditional Republicans would go home, and guess who was left? Members of Pat Robertson's organization, who elected themselves leaders, set the agendas, and that's how they, bit by bit, started taking over the party leadership at the local level. The method worked so well in Iowa that the Christian Coalition used the same tactic in several other states in the early 90s. And the Republican Party platforms at the state level started getting very interesting in the early 90s. In 1992, the Republican Party of Washington State outlawed witchcraft and yoga classes. Robertson told the Denver Post that same year, "We want as soon as possible to see a majority of the Republican Party in the hands of pro-family Christians. And to get their candidates elected, Reed and Robertson taught them to use stealth, avoid publicity, stay out of debates, work below the radar screen." They often didn't even campaign. Reed said to the Los Angeles Times, "It's like guerrilla warfare. It's better to move quietly with stealth under the cover of night." So while their candidates stayed out of the limelight, Christian Coalition campaigned on their behalf exclusively in fundamentalist Pentecostal and charismatic churches. And what they did is they passed out family values voter guides in those churches. By election time in 1994, they had distributed 40 million family value voter guides in 100,000 churches. And 1994 was a watershed year in this country. That was the year Republicans won majorities in both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. Time magazine credited the Christian Coalition with giving the Republicans these successes, and they called Ralph Reed the right hand of God. In 2000, 70 million voter guides were sent out to support George Bush. Christian Coalition, like many organizations, rates members of Congress by issuing congressional scorecards. And I find these scorecards very interesting. I use them to get a sense of Congress, where they stand. There's the Family Research Council. It's really interesting to look at their scorecards. So I took the Christian Coalition scorecards from this last Congress, and I used the Senate because there's only 100 members. The House is it's big, so it's hard to count. What I do is I take all the people that get 100% scorecard from Christian Coalition, put them all in a column. So I turn it into a graph. I'll show you the graph. So this is from 2004. So what you see along here is what the scores were, 100%, 80%, 60%. If you go up this side, that's the number of senators. So how many senators got 100% scorecard? 41. I'm here to trip you up in your math. Okay, so can you guess what color is Republican and which is Democrat? So 41 out of 51 Republicans last year got 100% rating from Christian Coalition. How many Democrats? One Democrat. I heard someone guess, Zell Miller. Yep. You may have seen him at the Republican convention blasting the Democrats, but there he was. If you go over here, this tells you how many got 0 rating. 31 out of 48 Democrats got 0. What you see that's interesting here is that no Republicans got below, 50. The 50% went over here. But you don't see any Republicans over in this side of the graph. and really only 3 right here. Those are your real moderates right there. Susan Collins, Olympia Snow of Maine, and Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island. Those are the real moderates. Partially moderate here, the 6 right here. So there's 9 that aren't 100%. Just to give you a sense of how far their reaches in Congress. Now, if you look at the whole Congress, 42% of the senators, that counts our 1 Democrat, got 100% rating from Christian Coalition. By the way, Zellmeller's retired now. He's going to be working for Fox News. According to exit polls in the 2004 election, 22% of the population identify as Christian right. What this suggests to me is that their numbers in Congress are double their actual numbers in the population. This says something about the importance of electoral politics, which Fred Clarkson's going to be talking about later, but they have used the electoral system very well. Their strategy of running stealth campaigns has worked well. And by the way, the form the stealth takes now is that they when they do make public speeches, they don't say who they really are. They talk like they're centrists. And that's pretty common. So you'll see someone like Ralph Reed, you'll go hear him speak, you think, God, he sounds like a cool guy. I mean, they actually can get up in front of an audience and sound like they're not who they are. So just to be aware of that. Okay, something very important that's worked for them is voter apathy. This has worked very well. Pat Robertson wrote in his book in 1990, The Millennium, with the apathy that exists today, a well-organized minority can influence the selection of candidates to an astonishing degree, and history has proven him correct. Ralph Reed wrote a book in 1996 called Act of Faith, How Christians Are Changing the Soul of American Politics. In that book, he wrote, the surest antidote to tyranny is a free people who believe it owes its allegiance to a higher power, not the government. In other words, as long as everyone shares his beliefs, we're all free. The U.S. Constitution, by the way, says the government owes its allegiance to the people, not a higher power. The very first 3 words are we the people. So Reed goes on to say, the consent of the governed rests upon faith in a sovereign God. Faith as a political force is the very essence of democracy. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia wrote something along the same lines in First Things, a journal of religion, when he wrote, government is the minister of God. Well, once you see government as the minister of God, you have to ask the obvious question. Whose God? Is it Scalia's God? Ralph Reed's God? What about Ralph White's God? Or the Dalai Lama? Do Hindus have a place in this democracy? The theocratic right believes that religions that aren't monotheistic, like Hinduism or Buddhism, are actually satanic. And what about people who don't believe in God? What happens to them in Ralph Reed's democracy? The framers of the U.S. Constitution, in their tremendous wisdom, saw the problem with saying government is the minister of God. They were well aware of the religious conflicts that decimated Europe for centuries. So they omitted the word God from our Constitution. The word God does not appear within the text of the Constitution of the United States. This was fully intentional. There is mention of a creator, but not in the Constitution. It's in the Declaration of Independence. And you'll hear that brought up a lot about this creator. But it's not, the Constitution is the law of the land, not the Declaration. That's a beautiful letter, we celebrate it, but it's not the Constitution. We have a president who wants to inject his God into the U.S. Constitution by appointing judges who share Scalia's view. Bush was quoted in a fundraising letter recently from the Traditional Values Coalition as saying, "We need common sense judges who understand that our rights are derived from God. Those are the kind of judges I intend to put on the bench." Once we have a government that believes it derives its authority from God, then we become a theocracy. If you ask folks from the Christian right if they believe in a theocracy, they'll say absolutely not. And they really don't, and they mean it. It's just that a democracy means everybody sharing Ralph Reed's idea of a higher power. Only a relatively small number of people actually identify with openly theocratic movements who make up the real core of the theocratic right, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. This brings us to the next section of the talk, called Dominion Theology or Christian Reconstructionism. I use these terms interchangeably. According to sociologist Sarah Diamond, Dominion theology is a belief that Christians alone are biblically mandated to occupy all secular institutions until Christ returns. And she goes on to say there's no consensus on when that might be. Dominionist author George Grant explains dominion theology in Bringing in the Sheaves. The army of God is to conquer the earth, to subdue it, to rule over it, to exercise dominion. In his seminal work, The Institutes of Biblical Law, the father of the Christian Reconstruction movement, the late Rousas Rushdoony, calls on Christ's elect people to subdue all things and all nations to Christ and his law word. Well, words like subdue, dominion, in this sense meaning control, are common in Reconstructionist literature. Reconstructionist authors Gary DeMar and Peter Leithart wrote, "The reign of Christ is meant to subdue every enemy of righteousness." Thomas Ice was a Christian Reconstructionist for 12 years before he decided he didn't agree with the theology. And Chip Relay is going to be talking about a very different theology that's really conflicts with the Christian Reconstructionists, but I'll let him talk about that. When he just came out of the Christian Reconstruction movement, he wrote a very thoughtful book I found really helpful called Dominion Theology, Blessing or Curse. It's a discussion of Christian Reconstructionism from someone who was very much on the inside. He explains that Christian Reconstructionists proposed to institute a theocratic government in America, and Christian Reconstructionists believe non-Christians cannot rule themselves and must be excluded from a government under God's law. Thomas Ice devotes one chapter of his book to this question. What would a reconstructed America be like? The only legitimate functions of the state, he says, are restraining civil evil, punishing evil, protecting the law-abiding, and defending the nation. What about all of the other functions of government? What about social programs, education, protection of the environment, protection of workers or consumers? The Texas Republican Party answers that question in their platform. The Texas Republican Party platform is very interesting to read and understand because it really is a blueprint for dominionism, how you carry out these ideas in government. They say, we support the abolition of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Office of Surgeon General, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Energy, Housing, Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Commerce, and Labor. We also call for the defunding or abolition of the National Endowment for the Arts and the public broadcasting system. Well, what happens to social programs and education? The churches will take them over. And this ideology is explained in a textbook that is very popular in Christian schools and the Christian homeschooling movement. And that's America's Providential History, written in 1989 by Mark Belisle and Stephen McDowell, and it's a best-selling book now. When I read this book, that's when the light bulbs went off in my head. It really helped me a lot to understand what was going on. And if you're going to read it, please know a little bit about history to realize that they have totally revised history. It's quite a piece of fiction, so I'm a little nervous to recommend reading it unless you have some grounding in history. Okay, so this book explains that churches, not the government, should be providing social programs. And it states that a government-controlled and funded welfare system is unbiblical. And Scripture makes it clear that God is the provider, not the state. Shifting back to Thomas Ice, and back to what a reconstructed America would be like, tax rates would be much less due to the shift in welfare burden away from government to the church. Okay, where do churches get their money? A member's tithe. They give 10% of their income to the church. Thomas Ice explains the tithe, not taxes, would finance most social welfare. Thomas Ice could be describing what's happening in our country. Taxes are being slashed even during a time of war and record deficits, and then billions of dollars in programs for the poor are being cut from federal programs and diverted to religious charities through the president's faith-based initiative. I believe the United States is beginning to fit the model of a reconstructed America. In 1977, Paul Weyrich founded the Free Congress Foundation. How influential is the Free Congress Foundation? Well, every Wednesday they hold special strategy sessions called Weyrich Strategy Sessions, and every Wednesday the White House has a high-ranking official going to those strategy sessions. His foundation produced a manifesto in 2001 declaring, "We will not try to reform the existing institutions. We only intend to weaken them and eventually destroy them." This statement illustrates a major difference between conservatives and the theocratic right. Conservatives want to reduce the role of the federal government and transfer more control to states, but they don't want to destroy existing institutions. The theocratic right is not conservative in any sense of the word. Back to Thomas Ice's chapter on a reconstructed America. Ice explains the centrality of biblical law. He writes, "Only through Old Testament civil law can America and the world be saved from destruction." Old Testament civil law means biblical law, which includes using the death penalty for people who sin against the Ten Commandments. The new senator from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn, believes in Old Testament biblical law. He was quoted in the Associated Press as saying, "I favor the death penalty for abortionists." This man needs to have some good bodyguards. He has been targeted for impeachment or worse. Who is he? Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. Now, Justice Kennedy was a Reagan appointment. His decisions lean toward the conservative. So why has he become the target of, just of such rage? Well, before June 26, 2003, consensual sex between couples of the same sex in the privacy of their own home was illegal in 13 states. I don't know if people realize it was actually illegal in those states. That all changed in 2003 in a landmark 6-3 Supreme Court ruling, and Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion for the majority. He wrote in Lawrence versus Texas, "The petitioners are entitled to respect for their private lives. The state cannot demean their existence or control their destiny by making their private sexual conduct a crime." Because of this, because of these words, Justice Kennedy has been labeled an activist judge. Frank Rich of the New York Times wrote, "The judges being verbally tarred and feathered are those who have decriminalized gay sex." This man, Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, Republican, is the third highest ranking Republican in the U.S. Senate. He's the number 3. So, and how does he get there? He's elected by his fellow Republicans. Okay? And he made a comment before that Supreme Court case, before that ruling, where he said to the Associated Press, "If the Supreme Court says you have the right to consensual sex in your own home, then you have the right to bigamy, you have the right to polygamy, you have the right to incest, you have the right to adultery." Well, if you take bigamy and polygamy out of the discussion, he's saying homosexuality should be a crime. And he goes beyond that. He's also saying adultery should be a crime. He's thinking in terms of biblical law. He's confusing biblical law and constitutional law. Reconstructionist author Gary DeMar explained what happens to gay people under biblical law in his radio show Sound Off, Superstation WSB in Atlanta. The Bible doesn't say that homosexuals should be executed. What it says is this: if two men lie together like a man and a woman lie together, they'll be put to death. And I've got to skip now because I only have 10 minutes. Oh, I don't know how this happened. Okay, we'll go right to David Barton. He's a dominionist who's reaching a lot of people. He's vice chair of the Texas Republican Party. He's also on the payroll of the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004, and listed by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in the country. He's made a living attacking the principle of separation of church and state. From the Texas Republican Party, our party pledges to exert its influence to dispel the myth of separation of church and state. He's a Christian nation activist. The Republican Party of Texas affirms that the United States is a Christian nation. And if you're wondering about whether or not that's true, I suggest you go to the year 1797, 10 years after the signing of the U.S. Constitution. A treaty was signed by the very people who signed the Constitution. So this, in 10 years, a lot of the same people were still there. There wasn't a single dissent. In 1797, the United States signed and ratified the Treaty of Tripoli, which states in Article 11, the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That was unanimously ratified by Congress. So we are not, never were intended to be a Christian nation, and that brings us to the next section, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, how the Reconstructionists are imposing their will on the rest of society. And I've got to rush through this because my time has run out. I don't know how that happened. But I will just tell you that the Reconstructionists see the Puritans as their kind of ideal society. The book says the primary strength of the Puritans was their spirit of dominion. They recognized the scriptural mandate requiring godly rule and zealously set out to establish that in all aspects of society. And I want to just show you ways that that's happening now. How the theocratic right is zealously setting out to establish their beliefs in all aspects of our society. And I'm going to go back to George W. Bush's very first inauguration. In 2001, 2 days after his inauguration, he just, overwhelmed the developing countries by reinstating the global gag rule and international family planning assistance, which silenced family planning organizations from ever mentioning the word abortion or losing their funding. Then the medical research establishment was stunned on August 9th when the president announced a ban on most kinds of stem cell research. Another blow came to international family planning in 2004 when the president cut off the entire American contribution to the UN Population Fund. There's the signing into law of a ban on so-called partial birth abortion. Don't you love that picture? It makes absolutely no exception for the life of the woman, which is why 3 federal courts so far have declared it unconstitutional. Pharmacists around the country are refusing to fill prescriptions for birth control or morning after pills. The State House of Michigan passed the Conscientious Objector Policy Act, which provides doctors with legal protection if they refuse to treat a gay person. Then there's in the House. It hasn't gone to the whole. It's one legislator. Then there's the E word, evolution. Biology teachers around the country, according to the New York Times, are actually dropping teaching of evolution because they're scared of stirring up controversy. A dozen IMAX theaters have banned movies that have to do with evolution. That's a science theater. Another E word, the environment. It's terrible. I don't have time to say more on that. And the last E word is the economy. There's the national debt. And then we'll not forget Terry Schiavo. There's her brother talking to 2 members of Congress. 1997, Oregon's death with dignity law went into effect, and it allows some terminally ill patients to seek physician-assisted suicide. Well, former Attorney General John Ashcroft sued the state of Oregon to have that law repealed, and his successor, Alberto Gonzalez, is carrying it to the Supreme Court. And I don't know how many of you saw Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby, but because there was an assisted suicide at the end, it's met with huge protest. And his comment I heard on NPR was that he was really surprised because he's been killing people all over the place as Dirty Harry. And nobody cared. But, this one loving act, and there's a protest. But people who identify they call themselves a culture of life are the strongest proponents of the death penalty and guns. So this ban on assault weapons was allowed to expire, and they never even brought it to the floor for a vote. CBS got a fine of $550,000 because Janet Jackson's breast was exposed during Super Bowl halftime. Justin Timberlake pulled off her vest and nobody said a thing. A violent, aggressive act was committed against a woman, and all that mattered was that her breast had been exposed. This man, Kevin Martin, is a very aggressive crusader against indecency. And some people associate that word with pornography, but it's really much broader. It's about imposing biblical law on the rest of society. And he was recently appointed chair of the Federal Communications Commission. The 5 people on that commission were given enormous power on February 16th when the House of Representatives passed the Broadcast Indecency Act. It authorizes the FCC to fine up to $500,000 for indecency violations. And so great is the chill cast by this act that 66 affiliates of CBS pulled Saving Private Ryan off the air, an Academy Award-winning film. Why? Because they used the Lord's name in vain. It's about biblical law. In schools, children are taught abstinence-only education, and the key word here is only. They don't encourage abstinence. It's the only. There's no other choice. And these examples demonstrate how bit by bit our choices are being taken away. Indecency police are a major part of theocratic states. I'm going to skip over this. But so great is the fear of homosexuality. This sponge was accused of being gay by James Dobson of Focus on the Family. SpongeBob SquarePants is a threat. And when the creator of SpongeBob heard that his character was gay, he said unbelievingly, "But he's a sponge." So I just got a sign up saying thank you, which means we're going to skip this last section about what we can do. But no, I promised that I would really go along with this. I don't know how. Well, okay. Okay. He changed it to 5 minutes from thank you very much. Okay, well, first, electoral politics is really important, and I had a lot on that, and I'm going to skip it because Frederick Clarkson's going to talk about it, and it's actually his writing that inspired me. But this electoral system of ours, we all need to get involved. This is our democracy. Okay, and he'll say more, so we'll skip it. But midterm elections is where they make the biggest gains, the theocratic right, because there's the least energy around the midterm elections. So 2006, get involved as you can, 2006 midterm election. And I'm going to say one last quick thing, and that's the importance of education. That this is the first. This conference is the first. This has been going on for 25 years, and this is the first time that it's really being focused in a way. The people I've been reading for decades are here this weekend. It's fantastic that Ralph did this. But this should have happened a decade ago. Education is really important, and you can all play a critical role, and that's why we schlepped down to New York City tons of DVDs of this talk. We have DVDs of a fabulous video produced by People for the American Way in 1982. It just is so professionally done and beautiful. It's only 28 minutes. It's all there. We sell everything at or below cost. We also, something you should know is that if you take a video to your public access TV station, they by law have to play it. That's why there's so much religious programming, because they keep feeding them these videos. So we have produced the DVDs into a video form to take to TV stations. So please check out our materials table. And I highly recommend it's called Life and Liberty for All Who Believe by People for the American Way, which was, even though it was made in 82, just takes you right there. And that's us. You can have such an impact. And each of you can play a role in that. You really can. We're really quite powerful, and we're the majority. Okay, so I'm going to close with a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Baptist Association, Danbury Baptist Association. When he was president, he wrote this. And what he said is, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, I contemplate with solemn reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Thank you very much.